XDoG, Advanced Image Stylization with Extended Difference-of-Gaussians, a somewhat edgy talk about DoGs in art by Holger Winnemüller. This talk is a bit different from other talks you may have heard at this event, insofar as I will not present any new technology to you. Instead, I will talk about some old technology with a new twist, and the possibilities this opens up for stylization. My hope is that I will inspire you to think about it in a new way and maybe even use it in one of your own projects. Specifically, I will give you some background about edge detection from a variety of disciplines. I'll introduce the DoG filter and its recent extensions, and I'll explain various effects and styles that can be achieved with the DoG filter. Let me start off by showing you pictures of some very old line drawings. The point here is to say that line art is about as old as the human desire to depict things. Now, some artists have become incredibly adept at illustrating subjects and pose with just a few skillfully placed lines. However, the act of observing these illustrations, of understanding and enjoying them, is actually no less fascinating because, after all, what we observe in the natural world looks much more like this. So, how come humans can use line drawings as such an effective method of visual communication? Part of the answer lies in the physiology of the human visual system. At a very basic level, the human eye consists of light-sensitive receptor cells. However, these do not send raw data along the optic nerve. Instead, they are connected via intermediate sensory neurons, called ganglions, to do some primitive signal processing. For example, some cells are hooked up in an antagonistic system where the system as a whole only fires if one or more central cells are excited, while the surrounding cells are not, or the other way around. Various cell systems have actually been found to detect edges or even gradients in specific orientations. Marr and Hildreth formulated a computational model of edge detection that identifies edges as zero crossings of the Laplacian of Gaussians, shown here as the Mexican head shape. This top part of the head is positive and models the center, while the bottom of the head points in the negative direction and models the surround. This Laplacian of Gaussians can be approximated conveniently by subtracting two normalized Gaussians corresponding to the center and surround fields. That is why we call the corresponding red curve the difference of Gaussians. To explain why such a system would be able to detect edges, we can look at the problem from a signal processing point of view. A Gaussian is a low-pass filter. That means it removes high spatial frequency detail while preserving low frequencies. Here, you can see the effect of removing high frequencies from an input image. As you can see, the image becomes blurred, similar to the action of a Gaussian filter. The surround field of the DoG filter has a wider support, so it removes more high frequencies. You can see that if we remove the green surround frequencies from the blue central frequencies, we get the red DoG response. In other words, the DoG filter is a bandpass filter, as it removes all frequencies except those in a narrow frequency band. Here's what the image within that frequency band looks like. You can see the edges corresponding to the frequency band starting to emerge. Of course, DoG edges aren't the only choices available. Even more popular are Sobel and Kenny edges. Sobel edges are trivial to implement, and Kenny edges have desirable properties for computer vision applications. However, I argue that for stylization purposes based on image processing, DoG edges offer the best trade-off between efficiency and visual aesthetic. And if I wanted to push the point, I could say that, but that'd be silly. Alright, so let's go into a little bit more detail about the DoG filter and its recent extensions. Here we have the definition for Gaussians. This is the standard DoG formula, and this is the extended DoG variation from some of my own previous work. All ready? Alright, let's go. Okay, it's actually quite simple. Never mind the math. Here we have an input signal that looks like this, which, as a height field, you can visualize like this, and if we convolve our DoG filter with the input signal, we get the red response. There you go. Now, if we define everything below the zero line to be an edge, these are the edges we get. If we change the zero threshold or shape of the DoG curve, we obviously obtain different edge responses. We can also choose between a hard and a soft threshold for edge detection. There are really three main parameters that vary the behavior from a standard DoG to an extended DoG, and these usually are adjusted together to obtain a desired effect. First, there's epsilon. I've already demonstrated how this shifts the threshold point up and down. As a result, the edge detector becomes more or less sensitive to edges. Next, we have tau, which changes the shape of the DoG curve. It changes the behavior from a pure edge detector to an edge detector with a tone response. As such, we can use it for tone mapping. Finally, we have phi, which adjusts the steepness of the threshold response curve between a pure step function and a soft fall-off function. The next DoG extension was introduced by Kang et al. In 2007. In the standard isotropic DoG case, the DoG kernel is applied independent of the image content, usually in a separable horizontal and vertical pass. That is, irrespective of where we are in the image, the edge detector is always evaluated exactly the same. Kang et al. Developed an anisotropic DoG formulation which first computes the edge tangent flow in an image, and then applies a modified DoG kernel which is locally oriented along the flow field. The two important parameters here are the kernel radius of the flow field computation, which determines how detailed or coarse the flow field is. And once we have computed the flow field, the other relevant parameter determines how far along the flow field we integrate to compute edges. To illustrate the effect, consider this noisy input image. The isotropic DoG detects spurious edges throughout the image and cannot generate a consistent edge contour. The flow DoG, however, integrates along flow lines and creates a closed contour while avoiding false positives. The beneficial effect of this is particularly pronounced in textures with a strong flow component, like fur or hair. In the remainder of the talk, the stylistic variations are due to the XDoG formulation, while the nice flowy look of the edges is due to the flow DoG approach. Next, I'm going to talk about some illustration effects that we get almost for free with the DoG filter. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to punt on the related work and refer you guys to the paper instead. But basically, what you need to know is that there are many cool systems out there which are specialized for a given effect, and most of which offer more control over the final output. In contrast, the effects I'm going to present are somewhat less versatile, but they are all generated within a single, simple and very efficient filter, and, unlike the projects on this page, require no user input. Let's talk about abstraction as illustrated here by the cartoonist Scott McCloud, which varies the level of detail from the very concrete, with lots of detail, to the very generic or abstract, with only the quintessential details remaining. We can look at this again from an information theoretic point of view. Here are two images, of which we only show the lowest frequencies. The images are blurred beyond recognition, but we can still make out the vague shapes of two faces. As we add more frequencies, the faces become more concrete. A female and male face emerges. Finally, if we add even more detail, the generic female and male forms take on concrete identities. Given that the DoG edges are extracted from a finite band of frequencies, it is clear that the radius of the DoG kernel has a direct influence on the abstraction of the depicted shape. For a small radius, many concrete details are detected as edges. For increasing radii, fewer and fewer details are detected and are combined into rougher and rougher shapes, until finally only the shape of a standing figure remains. In other words, blurring in the image domain is equivalent to shape abstraction in the edge domain. Indication is a technique that allows artists to hint at or indicate some image content, without having to fully represent it. If we look at this image of Kelvin, it seems a bit busy, and it's not very easy to visually separate Kelvin from the background. Now, if we look at the actual image by Bill Watterson without my modifications, he didn't actually draw every detail of every brick. Instead, he just drew parts of a few bricks and left it to the observer to fill in the rest. If we apply the DoG filter directly to a source image, we don't typically get much indication, because the DoG reproduces all edges. What we really kind of want is to couple the DoG with an importance measure, to say, draw some important edges while omitting all others. We can achieve this by pre-smoothing the source image with a bilateral filter. This is going to enhance strong contrast edges while blurring out weak contrast edges. The DoG edges of the bilaterally smoothed source image exhibit a simple form of indication. It should be pointed out that this approach does not work well for very complex or foreshortened textures, but I'm going to come back to this later. Artists have figured out ingenious ways to depict motion in static scenes. In this image by Scott McCloud, we can see examples of both speed lines, which are streak lines in the direction of motion, as well as ghosting, which are usually faded and offset temporal samples of the object in motion. In this talk, I only have time to talk about the former, but please refer to the paper for the latter. To understand how a DoG filter can generate speed lines, let's look at what happens when an object under motion is photographed. During the exposure time, the object moves, thereby painting itself onto the photo in the direction of motion. This can be modeled as a blur along the direction of motion. For structures that are aligned with the direction of motion, this has little effect, as the structure merely superimposes itself. However, for structures that are perpendicular to the motion, they become averaged with other neighboring structures and thereby becoming severely blurred. If we look at an actual image, we see that for a still car, all edges are reproduced equally. But for a moving car, which is blurred in the direction of motion, vertical lines are blurred away, while horizontal lines are left intact or even emphasized, resulting in horizontal speed lines in the direction of motion. The next effect looks at depicting content in high-contrast images, such as black and white artwork. In these examples by Frank Miller and Shigeru Mizuki, you can see standard black edges on white background as indicated by the blue arrows. Now in dark regions, these black edges would obviously not show up, so artists have come up with an inversion technique that I'll refer to as negative edges, indicated by these red arrows. In 3D, this phenomenon has been examined by DiCarlo and Ristchukevich, as well as Lee et al. For images, there have been some attempts to reproduce this effect, most of which are based on complex multipass systems such as the one by Rosen et al. While these systems allow for a lot of stylistic flexibility, the basic effect can simply and more efficiently be implemented with an XDoG filter. Let's look at this car image. If we apply a standard DoG filter, we get the expected edge response image. But if we modify the tone mapping parameter tau and apply soft thresholding instead of a step function, we can see that every positive edge is actually surrounded by a negative edge. So in other words, both positive and negative edges are actually always present in XDoG images, but it depends on the surrounding regions which edges are visible. In light regions, dark edges show up, while in dark regions, only the light edges come through. That is, the XDoG filter comes with edged inversion as a standard feature, and this is going to come in handy for the thresholding style, which I'm going to discuss next. In general, given that the DoG filter is supposedly quote-unquote just an edge detector, we can achieve a surprising range of styles by varying the parameters of the extended DoG. As we just seen, thresholding is a very intense look. If we just perform a binary quantization of the image, maybe with some pre-blurring to reduce noise, we get an effect like the Photoshop stamp tool. Clearly, we're missing some significant detail in both the light and the dark regions. The XDoG filter remedies this by exposing negative edges in dark regions. Thresholding actually has received a fair amount of attention lately. In some recent works, the process of thresholding is formulated as an optimization process that segments the image and transforms that segmentation into one only consisting of black and white segments. These approaches allow for some amount of shape simplification and abstraction, but are expensive to compute and are sensitive to small adjustments to parameter values. Compare this with the XDoG results, which compare favorably visually and are computed in real time. We can take this even a step further to create a woodcut style. To achieve this style, we use the same XDoG settings as for the thresholding above. However, we really crank up the radius used in the XDoG flow field computation. Yet another application of the thresholding result is hatching. Here we create a standard DoG edge image along with one or more thresholding images. Then we can take a scanned stroke texture and tile the image plane with it. For multiple threshold images, we'd use rotated copies of the hatching texture. Then we can simply use the edge images as masks for the hatching textures and multiply everything together, possibly onto a paper texture, to obtain the final result. Finally, we can create a pastel-like style as follows. We engage the tone mapping parameter tau to obtain a grayscale image with positive and negative edges. We keep the radius of the flow DoG computation relatively small, but increase the edge line integration along the flow field. This produces both smoothing and turbulence, resembling a dried brush paint. And of course, we can also add some of the original color back to achieve a colored pastel look. I hope at this point I've convinced you of the versatility of the XDoG filter and its many practical applications for stylization. But for a more theoretical discussion, I now want to loop back to the question I raised at the beginning of the talk. Why can we understand line drawings if there is nothing in the biological world that resembles them? The same question could of course also be asked about any of the effects discussed in this talk. Interestingly, perception research is beginning to answer some of these questions. While Hildreth and Marr's computational model of edge detection was mostly theoretical in nature, Young actually demonstrated that this model was practically implemented in the ganglion cells of cats, proving a biological viability of this approach. While you might have thought that inserting a bilateral filtering pass for the indication mechanism I presented earlier could be considered cheating, it is actually functionally equivalent to the first two stages of Malik and Perona's analytical perceptual model for pre-attentive texture discrimination. For motion, Kim and Francis showed that temporal streaking effects, such as speed lines, can be observed in the neural responses of cells stimulated by moving images. Personally, I believe that many artistic effects and styles may be traced back to the physiology, perception, and cognition of human vision. That is actually the common language of biology that allows artists to convey such complex scenes with such abstract means. NPAR has come a long way towards replicating and reproducing a variety of artistic styles and effects. However, we still understand very little about why and how humans are able to apply, interpret, and understand these visual effects. So, an interesting future research direction, in my opinion, is the development of computational models of human vision that are capable of explaining and optimizing the stylistic effects that artists have uncovered through trial and error. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take some questions.